Good morning, students. This is my next video lecture on the paper MELS203. In my previous class, I have shown you the syllabus of this paper and we have discussed the particular areas that we will be focusing in this paper. Today we will be starting with the syllabus and we will see what do we exactly understand by the literature of the 20th century. Now, as I was saying in the last class, that the 20th century is characterized by such overwhelming cultural dislocations, cataclysmic upheavals, and political turmoil that they would topple even the most substantial of beliefs and assumptions, leaving the grandeur of the past in ruins. Now, automatically, therefore, it encouraged a frenzied reconstruction. So this movement towards sophistication, towards technological advancement, towards internal self-skepticism, this movement has often been taken as the common base for a definition of modernism. Now, the perplexity of defining this age emerges particularly because the 20th century has witnessed a plethora of various movements in art, for example, Impressionism, Cubism, Futurism. We will be discussing these art movements in a later class. Then in society, such as Marxism, fascism, then feminism, etc. So naturally, we live in an era of bewildering complexity, where life has become so feverish and fitful that it is difficult to understand. It is this bafflement that is reflected in the 20th century literature, which has been manifested by different authors and poets. Now we will see what we exactly mean by modernism. Now, modernism is a philosophical movement that, along with cultural trends and changes, arose from wide-scale and far-reaching transformations in the world, in the Western society in the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, the word modern itself is rather vague and a baffling term because it means anything that has been written since Renaissance, which brought into the consciousness of the people the supremely dynamic idea of progress. However, we shall be focusing mostly on its significance in the 20th century. So modernism can be taken as a response by artists and writers to several things, which includes industrialization. It is a response to urban society, to the horrors of the World War, to technological change, and of course, propagation of philosophical ideas. Now, because the late 19th century experienced a spreading disillusionment with the existing models of the individual and the society, so naturally the Western world was transformed and there was a frenzied attempt to reinterpret, done by various philosophers and thinkers, who established notions by driving away those existing ones in the society, dealing with the individual and the natural world. So what are these factors that shaped this philosophical movement of modernism? First and foremost is definitely rapid growth of industrial societies. Now, as a direct result of industrial revolution, the modern era is characterized by a spirit of intellectual growth. And this was prompted by the emergence of factories and industries. Books, magazines, papers, all these which were not easily available before the industrialization, they became very easily available now. They were multiplied and cheapened, so common people could access books and articles. Moreover, locomotive and telegraph also advanced, and as a result, rapid and cheap intercommunication by mails and electricity came into being. So this resulted in an intellectual revolution, because education and knowledge could be circulated, and stimuli of an intellectual sort pour in upon us in various kinds of ways. The next factor is, of course, the horrors of the First World War. Now, the First World War and the years immediately before and after it brought about the demise of many institutions and beliefs. In terms of trauma itself, the effect of the First World War on modern consciousness can never be fully estimated. Moreover, it resulted in the invention of new weapons, poison gas, then guns, ammunitions, airplanes, submarines, which could only cause death and destruction. So definitely the First World War was a very decisive and defining moment in terms of both society and the individual. Now, breakdown with traditions. Now, the modern era definitely witnesses the end of the long reign of Queen Victoria, which was over by 1901. Now, I'm sure you are aware of the ages in which the history of literature is divided. So just prior to the modern age is the Victorian age. Now that's the reign of Queen Victoria came to an end in 1901. So the immediate reaction was the destabilization of the balance of power which the country had so long enjoyed in the sphere of politics. So with the breakdown of common terms of reference, there ensued a fierce interest in discovering new terms of artistic exploration with renewed emphasis on technique, on form, on structure, etc. So naturally, modern literature is experimental in its approach, but it is enormously compressed. Brief lines allude to complex ideas, comic set pieces enact philosophical theories. So if Victorian literature was concerned with morality, with then modern writing was concerned more with aesthetics. So in the literature of the 20th century, we find a definite tendency towards feelings of apocalypse and despair. So from this perspective, we can say that modernist texts often focus on social, spiritual, and personal collapse. That is the second last point. That is also a factor that shaped modernist ideas. Now, this therefore also results in a preoccupation with the inner self. So the literature of the 20th century delves deep into the psyche of the characters that imply the possibility of myriad of interpretations. So quite obviously, therefore, it is revolutionary, for it probes into human consciousness, into the inner self of the characters. It draws the readers into the mindscape of the characters. So this definitely brings about new paradigms in literary contributions. So this spirit of interrogation and skepticism, inquiry and search, all these exposed the futility of the Victorian values. Quite naturally, therefore, the 20th century can also be regarded as the age of disillusionment. Now we will see some of the pioneers who brought about modernist ideas into being. So the precursors of modernism, obviously, we will begin with the influence of science. Now, the empirical and skeptical spirit of science played a very important role in the dissolution of old social acceptance. So the scientific approach affected also the field of economic and social investigations. Moreover, scientific investigation is nowhere better illustrated than in the rapidly developing study of biology, of physics, and psychology. So here we will be focusing on these three particular areas, starting with Charles Darwin. Now, Charles Darwin was an English naturalist, and in his work, major work called On the Origin of Species, he has destroyed the myth or illusion of man's divine origin. This is what we refer to as his theory of evolution. Now, in this book, he proved that man was not created in the image of God, which the priests and the church had always emphasized on. So he propounded the fact that man was not planted in the idyllic atmosphere of the Garden of Eden in paradise. According to Darwin, this man began his life as a jellyfish, and through millions of years of evolution, waging a ceaseless battle for his survival, man has at last reached the present stage. This is called the struggle for existence in Darwinian terms, or the survival of the fittest. That is, the weaker species will either have to adapt themselves to the changing environment, or they will have to perish in the process. So this struggle for existence, according to Darwin, goes on relentlessly in human life. And this very idea has contributed sufficiently in molding modernist thoughts. Thus, man has ceased to be the heir of the biblical Adam and Eve. Now, the idea of social Darwinism is another contribution of Charles Darwin, where he argues that human societies can improve and evolve in the same way that species do. But societies too, therefore, have their origins and their antecedents. Just as apes are considered to be related but underdeveloped humans, in that same way, in the 1890s, non-European societies were perceived as related but underdeveloped or degenerated civilizations. Now, you will be seeing how these ideas are reflected in some of the works of literature. And we will find that in texts like The Picture of Dorian Gray, Dr. Jekyll, and Mr. Hyde, the monstrous self of human beings are emphasized. So this is how we find that Darwin created or influenced deeply modern texts. The next is, of course, another very popular and world-renowned scientist, Albert Einstein. I'm sure you have heard of. Now, Einstein's belief in space-time continuum and his theory of relativity effected an irreversible paradigm shift in the understandings of the physical universe. Therefore, while writers of the previous age depicted time in a chronological and linear manner, we find that modernist writers, they express time moving in arcs, in flashbacks, repetitions, and above all, subjective leaps and swerves. These are nothing but influence of Einstein's space-time continuum. These are very much reflected in the writings of Joyce, Woolf, and Pound, particularly in the Epiphanies of Joyce, in the stream of consciousness technique of Woolf, and in the imagism of Pound. Proceeding further, we will be focusing on psychology. Now, the new biological discoveries of Darwin had direct and indirect relation with the science of psychology. And definitely in this sphere, there are some leading psychologists, and the most important is, of course, Sigmund Freud, who is an Austrian psychoanalyst. Now, Freud considers the mind to be divided into three parts. So his idea or his theory of the tripartite structure of the human mind and his concept of Oedipus complex, these are some of the most important contributions that we find reflections in literary texts. Now, Freud considers the mind to be divided into conscious and the unconscious, and the unconscious he views as divided into two parts, the id and the superego. Now, according to Freud, the unconscious is he considers the unconscious as the outspring of all human actions and motives. So Freudian psychology stresses the unconscious, which is that part of our mind which is even unknown to us. So we come in contact with this unknown dark recess of the mind in dreams, in daytime reveries, in slips of tongue, in forgetfulness, etc. So psychoanalysis has discovered many of the principles that guide personality development, then the mechanics and dynamics by means of which the mind works, and hidden motives that prompt so much of our behavior. Now, one of the most important works of Sigmund Freud is, of course, the interpretation of dreams. You have to remember this. Now, apart from Freud, we have three other psychologists who had contributed sufficiently in shaping the modernist thoughts, and these are the notions of collective unconscious provided by Carl Gustav Jung. Next, we have the idea of inferiority complex by Alfred Adler. And of course, the theory of conditioned reflex by Ivan Pavlov. I would like to speak on inferiority complex a little. According to Ivan Pavlov, the idea of inferiority complex, or rather for him, the true way of understanding human psychology lies in the recognition of an unconscious feeling of inferiority, which keeps lurking in our mind. So this unconscious mind, he believes, requires some gratification or compensation. Hence, the complexes which evoke from the lower recesses of the mind make our life torturous, monstrous, and miserable. So it is from this perspective that the attitudes and temperaments of Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini can be explained from the viewpoint of the theory of inferiority complex. And according to the notion of conditioned reflex, human will is reduced to nothing. So this principle has led to the school of behaviorism, which we find reflected in Aldous Huxley's novel Brave New World. So here we have some of the texts and their authors, which can be interpreted from the psychological point of view, notably D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers, James Joyce's Ulysses, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, and a play by Eugene O'Neill, Morning Becomes Electra. So in these works, we find reflections of psychology. Now here we have these four figures: Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, and Ivan Pavlov. So I will be stopping here today, and in the next class we will delve deeper and we will see what are the contributions of other thinkers and philosophers. So I hope that you have got some idea about the literature of the 20th century, which is experimental in approach, which is dealing with an idea of disillusionment, and which is depicting an age of chaos and crisis. So I would suggest you to read something on modern literature, the books that I have recommended in the last class, so that you get a proper hold of the 20th century. And of course, look at the background also, how Darwinism affected in shaping the modernist thoughts. What are the contributions of the psychologists and how they have influenced the literature of the 20th century. In the next class, we will be carrying on with this lesson with the other thinkers who contributed sufficiently in molding the literature of the modern age. Until then, thank you.